A black girl, no older than 9, stood alone near the edge of the schoolyard while a crowd of children gathered under the mid-morning sun. There was excitement in the air. Today was Community Heroes Day, and a local police officer had come to speak about safety and courage. She had been looking forward to it all week. The other kids whispered about firefighters, police dogs, and helicopter rides. But she had her own reason to be proud. Her dad was coming to pick her up right after. Not just any dad. A real-life Delta Force soldier. A hero. Her hero. So when the officer asked the class if they knew what it meant to be brave, she raised her hand with quiet confidence. He called on her, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Her voice was clear, honest, full of admiration when she said, "My dad's in Delta Force. He fights bad guys. He's the bravest man I know." A few of the kids chuckled nervously. The officer's eyes narrowed for a second before he leaned in with a grin that wasn't kind. "Delta Force," he repeated, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Sweetheart, your daddy might deliver Delta pizza, but he's not fighting anything except traffic." The kids burst out laughing. The kind of laughter that stings. That isolates. That says you don't belong here. She froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the teachers standing nearby, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something, to do something. No one moved. Even the principal gave a half-hearted chuckle. The officer kept smiling like he'd just told the best joke of the day. She looked down at the ground. Her chest burned with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was deeper. It was betrayal. She had told the truth. Her dad had missed birthdays, holidays, whole summers. He had done that to protect people like this man. And now, in front of everyone, her truth was mocked. Dismissed. Reduced to a joke. And then came the whispering. "She's lying. There's no way. Her dad's probably in jail." The officer didn't stop them. He was still chuckling, calling up another student to answer, already moving on like she didn't exist. Her fists clenched. Her eyes burned. She stood there, humiliated, with every second carving the memory deeper into her mind. She hadn't cried. Not then. But she would later. And not because she was weak, but because she had been made invisible. But that moment, it didn't end the way he thought it would. 34 minutes later, a black SUV with government plates glided into the school parking lot like a ghost cutting through fog. No sirens. No noise. Just presence. Its doors swung open in one fluid motion. 2 figures stepped out, one in full tactical gear, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, the other dressed down but unmistakably alert. The man who walked past the teachers without a word, who moved like silence had weight, like the air stepped aside for him, that man did not look like someone to laugh at. He walked through the crowd as the officer was still talking. The moment he stepped onto the blacktop where the presentation was still ongoing, every child fell silent. Not because they knew who he was, but because something in his presence demanded it. The officer blinked, confused, and then slightly annoyed. He stepped forward. "Excuse me, this is a school event. You can't just," the man raised one hand. "Just one." And the officer stopped mid-sentence. Then he looked at the girl. Still standing to the side, still shrinking into herself. Their eyes met, and something changed in her posture. Her chin lifted a little. Her shoulders pulled back. She didn't smile. But she breathed. And that was all he needed. What happened next stunned the entire crowd. Because this man, this soldier, didn't yell. Didn't hit. Didn't threaten. What he did was far more powerful. He took the microphone, stood in front of hundreds of students, teachers, staff, and stared directly into the soul of the man who had humiliated his daughter. And then he told a story. Not a story about guns or war or glory. A story about dignity. About silence. About the cost of being told you don't belong in a place where you've given everything just to be allowed to stand. He didn't use her name. Didn't mention what had been said. But somehow, every word was a mirror held up to the one who mocked her. And by the time he was done, no one was laughing. Not a child. Not a teacher. Not even the officer, who now stood frozen, pale, stripped of his arrogance. But the story doesn't end there. Because the officer's mic had been live. Broadcasting. Recorded. Streamed. And the truth? It doesn't care how uncomfortable it makes people. What followed would unravel years of quiet discrimination hidden behind polite policies. A school board forced to reckon with what it allowed. A department exposed. A man's career shattered not by revenge, but by the weight of his own actions, played back for all to hear. And her? The little girl who was laughed at. She didn't become a viral video. She became a symbol. Not of pain, but of pride. Not because of what her father did that day, but because of what she endured before he arrived. But here's the thing that no one saw coming. What was the one thing her father said at the end of his speech that left even the officer speechless? What truth did he reveal, so personal and powerful, that the entire school stood in silence? And how did that moment change not just the lives in that schoolyard, but reshape the course of an entire city? You're going to want to stay with us until the end. Because what happens when a father answers humiliation with something stronger than rage, is something no one forgets. Ever. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in any form. Your experiences matter, your voice matters, and your dignity is non-negotiable. This channel is a space that values truth, justice, and representation, and we will always amplify the stories that deserve to be told, especially the ones that have been ignored for too long. Now, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for a powerful journey. And hey, if this message or story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You're not alone. We're in this together. Enjoy the story. St. Paul, Minnesota. A city known for its crisp, biting winters and postcard-worthy streets lined with history and contradictions. It was a place where churches sat quietly across from liquor stores, where high school marching bands practiced down the same sidewalks where protests once roared. In this city, divided more by lived experience than by any map, lived a man named Marcus Boyd. To most people, Marcus was invisible. That was how he liked it. Blending in had always been part of the job. Quiet exits. Unnoticed entries. One name on a list among many, often blurred or blacked out, no trail. But what most people couldn't see was what mattered most. Marcus had spent 16 years in the shadows, running black ops missions in regions that most Americans couldn't pronounce, let alone find on a map. He was Delta Force, classified, highly trained, with instincts honed sharper than any blade. But in St. Paul, he was just that quiet dad who keeps to himself. At home, though, Marcus was something entirely different. He was a father. Fully, obsessively, and without hesitation. To his 9-year-old daughter, Layla, he was the son. She didn't know about the classified missions, the bullet wounds, or the negotiations with armed warlords. All she knew was that he could braid hair with military precision, make the fluffiest blueberry pancakes on Sunday mornings, and listen without checking his phone even once. She didn't need proof of his bravery, she saw it in how he never raised his voice, never interrupted her, never let her go to bed feeling unheard. In her world, that was heroism. Layla had her father's eyes, intense and observant, but the rest of her was pure joy. Her laugh echoed like music. She was curious, stubborn, and disarmingly thoughtful. She collected facts like treasure, how many bones in the human hand, what octopus blood was made of, who the first black astronaut was. Marcus called her his walking Wikipedia. But for all her brilliance, Layla still carried the weight of being different. Her school, Northview Elementary, was in a part of town that liked to preach diversity but rarely practiced it. Layla was one of 5 black students in a class of 32. And though no one ever said it outright, she always felt she had to explain herself twice, once to be seen, and again to be believed. Marcus had noticed this the moment they moved into the neighborhood. The lingering stares. The sudden silence when he entered a room. The way white parents pulled their children just slightly closer during school events. He'd chosen St. Paul because it was quiet, and quiet was safe, but even silence had teeth. Then there was Officer Brent Hadley. Hadley was the school's assigned community liaison, a title that sounded comforting, until you met the man. In his late 40s, Hadley carried himself like he was still chasing down suspects on the street. Barrel-chested, buzz-cut, and always half-smirking, he didn't walk through the school so much as occupy it. He had an old-school cop mentality, authority first, empathy if there's time. His presence always felt heavier when he was around students like Layla. She noticed it. Marcus noticed it. But neither of them ever said it aloud. Hadley wasn't overtly cruel. That's what made him dangerous. He operated in the subtle space, sarcastic comments dressed as jokes, long pauses before addressing students of color, unnecessary questions asked with a grin. He'd never raised his voice, but somehow, you always felt smaller after speaking to him. To the staff, he was Brent, the guy who brought donuts every other Friday and always stayed late for PTA meetings. To Marcus, he was a red flag dressed in blue. It was Layla who first told her father about Community Heroes Day. They said real heroes are coming, Daddy. Like firefighters and soldiers and police. Her eyes sparkled as she pulled the crumpled flyer from her backpack. Marcus scanned it. Local officers, EMTs, AK, 9-unit demonstration. He raised an eyebrow. You gonna tell them what your dad does? He teased. Layla hesitated for the first time. I don't know. Some kids don't believe me when I say you're a soldier. They say I'm making it up. That sentence sat heavy between them. Marcus forced a smile. Well, if they don't believe you, they just haven't met the right kind of soldier yet. Layla nodded, but he could see the uncertainty settling in her shoulders. She wanted to be proud. She was proud. But pride gets complicated when you're 9 years old, surrounded by people who are quick to laugh and slow to understand. The morning of the event came with cold air and clear skies. Marcus dropped her off like always, quiet and steady, but his eyes lingered a little longer as she walked into the building. Something was off in her posture. He could feel it in his gut. He didn't know that today would test every lesson he had taught her about self-worth and strength. He didn't know that today, her trust in the world would be bruised in a way he couldn't undo. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Children wiggled in their seats. Teachers corralled excitement into straight lines. The stage had banners and balloons. A microphone stood center stage, where the invited guests would speak. Officer Hadley arrived like he owned the room, shaking hands, patting backs, winking at secretaries. When it was his turn, he launched into his speech with theatrical confidence, talking about bravery and service and the thin blue line. The kids clapped. The adults smiled. It was all polished. Predictable. Then he asked the crowd, "Can anyone here tell me what it means to be really brave?" Layla raised her hand. Hi. Without hesitation. Hadley looked at her, pausing for half a second longer than necessary before calling on her. Go ahead, sweetheart. My dad is Delta Force. He's really brave. He goes on secret missions to protect us. A beat of silence. Then the smirk. Delta Force, huh, he repeated, letting the words linger in the air like a punchline. Well, maybe he's fighting the battle of the backyard grill. Or maybe Delta just means he's good at airline miles. Laughter followed. Hesitant at first. Then rolling. A few teachers exchanged glances. One teacher bit her lip. The students laughed louder. Layla's face fell, not because she didn't expect disbelief, but because it came from someone adults told her to trust. The moment was small on the surface, but it cracked something large open. Her classmates now had permission. Permission to doubt. To mock. To belittle. And no one, no adult, intervened. Layla didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes burning holes into the floor. She never looked at Hadley again. But he never looked away. His smirk remained like a stain on the moment, as if he knew she wouldn't forget it, and didn't care. At the same time, Marcus sat alone in his truck a few blocks away. He was scheduled to pick Layla up for a dentist appointment. He had no idea what was happening inside. No idea that a lifetime of discipline and restraint would be tested before the hour was over. No idea that a moment of humiliation would demand a father to decide, not between violence or silence, but something far more powerful. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He hated the spotlight. But when your child is wounded by the very system you defended, something shifts inside you. He had 34 minutes to reach the school. And when he arrived, he didn't knock. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wait for permission. And sometimes, a soldier's mission begins the moment his daughter looks up and realizes, someone needs to believe her. The air inside the school had shifted. Not everyone noticed it, but Layla did. After the incident in the auditorium, there was a strange quiet around her. The other kids didn't say much, but their look said everything. Doubt. Mockery. Superiority cloaked in playground whispers. She sat through math with her hands clenched in her lap, her pencil untouched, her thoughts replaying that moment again and again. Officer Hadley's voice kept echoing in her mind, condescending, dismissive, cruel in its smugness. She wondered if he even knew how much damage he'd done, or if people like him ever noticed the way they left people aching without ever raising their voices. That afternoon, even her teacher, Mrs. Keeley, seemed unsure of how to look her in the eye. She tried to smile once, but it came out crooked, like guilt hiding behind a mask of politeness. Meanwhile, Marcus parked 3 blocks away, scanning the building through his windshield. His eyes weren't just watching, they were calculating. Exit points. Surveillance angles. Routine patrol routes. It was an instinct, built into his bones after years of missions. But this time, it wasn't for a high-value target. It was for a child. His child. The briefing wasn't classified, it was personal. Layla hadn't texted him, but he knew. He always knew when something was off. That morning, her excitement had dimmed too quickly. Her voice was smaller. And in his gut, something twisted when he saw that flyer. He had tried to shake it off. Told himself he was being paranoid. But Delta Force didn't teach paranoia. It taught awareness. And right now, everything in him screamed that his daughter had been hurt. Not physically. Worse. Inside, Brent Hadley was finishing his rounds. After his little show in the auditorium, he felt untouchable. The laughter had fed his ego, even if it hadn't been unanimous. He liked moments like that, when the room followed his lead. When no one dared to challenge his words, especially not a kid. Especially not one like her. He caught a glimpse of Layla passing in the hallway. She didn't look at him. Not once. He smirked and kept walking. Later, when a few teachers quietly mentioned the moment, hinting that maybe the joke went too far, he brushed them off. Said the girl needed toughening up and that kids today were too sensitive. One of them frowned, but no one argued. That was the thing about Brent, he was always just inside the line. Just careful enough. Just tolerated enough. But the cracks were beginning. As the final bell rang, Marcus was already inside. Not storming. Not causing chaos. Walking with quiet intent, eyes forward, movements smooth. He signed in at the office like any other parent. No alarm. No disruption. The secretary looked up, recognizing him with a faint smile. "You're here for Layla." He nodded, and she buzzed him through. His boots echoed down the hallway, each step a reminder of the discipline that kept his rage contained like steam under pressure. He didn't need to yell. The reckoning wouldn't come in decibels. It would come in truth. Layla was waiting by the office. When she saw him, her lips trembled, just for a second. Not because she was scared, but because she didn't want to cry. He kneeled, met her eye level, and placed his hand on her shoulder. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he just whispered, "I know." And she nodded, tears welling but not falling. As they turned to leave, a voice called out from the hallway. "Hey, Boyd." Marcus turned slowly. Hadley stood at the far end of the corridor, arms crossed, posture smug. "Heard your girl made quite the statement this morning. Delta Force, huh?" His laugh was low, private, ugly. "She's got an imagination. You must be proud." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He took a moment. Took a breath. Then stepped forward with Layla beside him. "She doesn't need to imagine anything," he said, voice calm, eyes locked. "She knows exactly who I am." Hadley laughed again, louder this time, as if trying to reclaim some kind of dominance. "I've worked with enough vets to know most of them like to talk big. Especially when they're not in uniform anymore. You people love the war stories." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed still. "You think you know who I am?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You think this is a story?" Hadley smirked. "I think your daughter's been telling tales, and now you're here to put on a show." Marcus looked down at Layla, who clutched his hand tightly. Then he looked back up and said, "The only show here is the one you performed in front of children. And the worst part is, you thought it made you look strong." The tension in the air was palpable. A few teachers had gathered in the hallway, pretending to walk by, but really listening. Layla noticed. She saw their hesitation. Their quiet curiosity. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a level only Hadley could hear. "You humiliated a child to feel powerful. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are. But I don't need to yell. I don't need to prove anything to you." Hadley stepped back slightly, unprepared for the weight of that silence. Marcus turned and walked away, his hand still holding Layla's. No more words. No grand exit. Just presence. But it didn't end there. That night, Layla told her mother what happened. Her voice was still shaky, but she didn't hide it. She repeated everything. The auditorium. The joke. The laughter. Her mother, Tamara, was furious. She wasn't military. She was a lawyer. And she knew exactly how this would look in writing. But Marcus stopped her from making a scene right away. "Not yet," he said. "Let them show who they are." The next day, a video surfaced. One of the teachers had recorded the assembly to share with parents. The moment where Hadley mocked Layla was clear. Loud. Unmistakable. Within hours, it had been shared in a private group of parents. Then it leaked. Then it spread. Suddenly, Marcus wasn't the only one watching. The entire city was starting to pay attention. At the school, tensions grew. Parents started asking questions. Some defended Hadley, saying he was just joking. Others, especially parents of color, demanded accountability. Meetings were scheduled. Statements were prepared. But the pressure wasn't coming from outrage. It was coming from truth. Unfiltered. Undeniable. Hadley was called into the principal's office. Twice. His tone was different now, defensive, annoyed, slightly panicked. It was a joke, he repeated. She took it the wrong way. But every time he said it, it sounded less convincing. Even to himself. Marcus remained silent publicly. He didn't post. Didn't threaten. But behind the scenes, he was working. Building something. Not revenge. Something cleaner. More powerful. He told Layla, sometimes, people like that expect us to yell. To break. That's how they win. But if we hold the line, they trip over their own arrogance. Layla nodded, still unsure. But what if he doesn't get in trouble? Marcus smiled softly. Then we show them why silence isn't weakness. Days passed. The media caught on. The school board received formal complaints. Teachers who once stayed quiet began to speak up. Some confessed that this wasn't the first time Hadley had crossed the line. Just the first time someone recorded it. Momentum built slowly, like a tide creeping up the shore. And Hadley? He started feeling it. Meetings turned colder. Smiles faded. The same people who laughed now avoided eye contact. Layla returned to school, head held high. She didn't speak much. But she didn't have to. Her presence alone made people rethink what they thought they knew. And then came the moment no one expected. The school scheduled a second assembly. A clarification meeting. To address the misunderstandings. To control the narrative. But what they didn't know was that Marcus had made a request. And that request had been accepted. He was invited to speak. Not as a soldier. Not as a threat. As a father. As a man. And what he was about to say, what he was about to reveal, would silence the entire room. Because in that moment, the line between humiliation and honor would be drawn in a way that no one could deny. The truth was coming. And it would speak louder than any uniform ever could. The gymnasium was filled with a kind of silence that doesn't just happen, it builds, layer by layer, from tension, expectation, and discomfort. Rows of metal chairs stretched across the polished floor, lined with students, teachers, and parents, all brought together for what had been labeled a community reflection assembly. The staff had tried to make it feel normal, like any other school event, but nothing about the atmosphere was normal. It was too still. Too alert. Every word spoken felt like it echoed louder than it should have. Everyone knew why they were there. And everyone was waiting. The principal, Mrs. Halvorsen, stood at the podium with a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes scanned the room, skipping over the parents of color who now sat closer to the front than they usually did. The board had issued their carefully polished statements the day before. Apologies had been written, reviewed, and filtered through public relations lenses. But none of that mattered now. Because Marcus Boyd was in the room. And he wasn't there for apologies. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to speak. When his name was called, he rose from the third row with calm precision. Layla, seated beside her mother, watched him walk to the center of the gym as though he were stepping into a battlefield where no weapons were drawn, but every eye was loaded with judgment. He wore no uniform, no medals. Just a simple dark coat and jeans. But somehow, he carried more authority than any badge ever could. He didn't climb onto the stage. He stood flat on the ground, in the middle of the people, leveled with the children who'd been watching this story unfold without always knowing what they were witnessing. He looked around. The silence deepened. And then he began. There's a moment in every soldier's life, he said, when the mission stops being about orders. And starts being about something you can't write in a report. Something no superior officer can brief you on. It's the moment you realize you're not fighting for flags or maps. You're fighting for someone's right to feel safe. To be heard. To be seen. He paused, scanning the crowd. My name is Marcus Boyd. Some of you might know that already. Most of you don't. And until now, I didn't need you to. I never wanted attention. I never cared for credit. But last week, my daughter stood up in this very school and told the truth about her father. And she was mocked. Not by her peers. But by a man given a badge and a microphone. A man who confused cruelty for leadership. A faint shuffle passed through the crowd. Hadley, seated to the far left, shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. But Marcus didn't look at him yet. My daughter told the truth. I am a soldier. Not because I wear camouflage. Not because I've held a gun. But because I've had to stand in front of the worst humanity has to offer and say, not today. I've been deployed 12 times. I've served in places you won't find in news stories. I've lost teammates I called brothers. And I've never once raised my voice in a debrief, or cracked a joke in a moment that demanded dignity. He stepped forward slightly. The crowd didn't move. Breath was barely audible now. But none of that qualifies me to speak today, he continued. What qualifies me is that I'm a father. And fathers know when their children have been broken in ways you can't see with your eyes. They feel it. Like a vibration beneath your ribs. You don't need to see the wound to know it's there. He turned, finally, toward Hadley. You broke something in my daughter that day. Not because you didn't believe her. But because you did. And you couldn't handle that truth coming from someone who looked like her. A sharp inhale rippled through the staff section. Mrs. Keeley blinked hard, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. One of the board members adjusted his tie, visibly flushed. Hadley didn't move. You thought you were challenging a lie, Marcus said, his voice still steady. But what you challenged was the foundation every child builds their identity on. You told her that her truth wasn't just unbelievable, it was laughable. And in doing that, you told every child who looks like her that their pride is too heavy to carry in a white space. He let that sentence sit. No one interrupted. Now, here's the part one didn't plan to share, he said, taking a step toward the front. Because some things are meant to stay quiet. Until they're not. He pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. It wasn't showmanship. It was memory. This letter, he said, is from the Department of Defense. Dated August 12, 2021. It's a commendation for actions taken during an extraction mission in northern Syria. It says, and I quote, Sergeant Marcus Boyd, Delta Detachment, executed a civilian rescue operation under enemy fire with 0 casualties and critical asset retrieval. Subject demonstrated leadership, psychological composure, and unprecedented restraint in the face of imminent threat. He let the paper fall to his side. But my daughter doesn't know me for that, he said quietly. She knows me for bedtime stories. For pancakes shaped like animals. For walking away from a fight when I have every reason to stay in it. That's the kind of soldier she knows. And that's the kind of bravery she stood for when she said my name. Then his voice sharpened, not louder, but heavier. And the fact that the response to her pride was humiliation tells me everything I need to know about this system. Hadley's hands were on his knees now, clenched tightly. He looked around and saw fewer supportive eyes than he had expected. People weren't buying the joke anymore. The shield of silence that had protected him for so long had started to crack. Marcus faced the audience again. This isn't about vengeance, he said. This is about visibility. My daughter deserves to walk into a classroom and be believed when she speaks. Not because of what I've done. But because she is worthy of respect without needing proof. Every child is. He nodded once, his expression resolute. I've been in rooms with foreign generals, warlords, and tactical command. But I've never felt the weight of a room like I do now. Because this is the battlefield that matters most. Right here. In schools. In hearts. In what we allow to be laughed at. Then he turned and walked back to his seat, passing Hadley without looking at him again. Silence held for several long seconds after he sat. And then, somewhere near the back, a single clap echoed. Then another. Then more. Until the room was filled with a slow, deliberate applause, not the kind of cheer you hear after a show, but the kind that rises from a place deeper than performance. It was a reckoning. And Hadley? He didn't clap. He sat still, eyes fixed ahead, a man watching his image crumble in real time. But even then, Marcus hadn't said everything. Because the next voice to rise wasn't his. It was Layla's. She stood slowly, hands trembling, but eyes fierce. And when she spoke, the gym fell silent again. And what she said would finish what her father started, and shift the weight of every unspoken truth into the open air. Layla's small frame stood out in the sea of chairs as she slowly rose, her fingers nervously brushing the hem of her sweater. The applause that had filled the room was now trailing off into a stunned silence, like a wave retreating back into the ocean. No one expected her to speak. No one even considered that she might have something to say after what her father had just laid down with such power and control. But she wasn't standing because someone told her to. She wasn't standing because she had practiced a speech or had anything memorized. She was standing because something inside her refused to stay quiet anymore. She stepped forward, just a few feet, into the narrow space between the chairs and the open floor. Her eyes swept across the sea of faces, many of which were looking at her in a way they hadn't before, not with doubt or dismissal, but with an uncomfortable kind of attention. The kind that realizes a truth is about to be spoken. She clutched her fingers together, trying to stop them from shaking, but her voice when it came was steady. Fragile, but certain. When I said my dad was in Delta Force, I didn't say it to sound cool, she said, her voice echoing louder than expected in the quiet gym. I said it because I was proud. I was proud of who he is. I still am. But the second I said it, the person with the microphone laughed. And everyone else laughed too. And I didn't understand why. Because no one ever told me that telling the truth could make people laugh at you. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last words, and she paused, breathing deeply through her nose, grounding herself. Her mother had risen partway from her seat behind her, ready to step in, but Marcus gently placed a hand on her arm. Let her speak, his gesture said. Let her be heard. Layla glanced in Officer Hadley's direction, but not for long. She didn't want to see his face. She didn't want her words to be about him. She wanted them to be about her truth. When he said that thing about my dad delivering pizza, she continued, it didn't just hurt me because it wasn't true. It hurt because it made me feel like nothing I said would ever matter. Like I was invisible. Like the only thing people saw when they looked at me was someone who couldn't possibly be telling the truth. And that's the part that hurt the most. There was a murmur from the crowd, parents shifting, students whispering quietly to one another, teachers bowing their heads. Some of the children who had laughed now looked down at their shoes, guilt settling into their young faces. The rawness in Layla's voice was doing something that no adult's authority ever could. It was humanizing her pain. I started to think maybe I shouldn't talk about my dad anymore. Maybe it was safer to pretend he just had a regular job like everyone else's parents. But then I watched him stand here and talk about what it means to fight for someone else, and I realized I shouldn't be the one hiding. Her voice grew firmer now, stronger, a surprising power building in her words. My dad doesn't need a uniform to be brave. And I don't need to stay quiet to be respected. I know who he is. I know who I am. And no one in this school gets to tell me I'm too small, or too black, or too anything to be proud of that. The gymnasium was frozen in time. There were no cheers, no noise, no clapping yet. Just the weight of her truth settling like dust after a storm. Layla's hands finally relaxed, falling to her sides as she looked to her classmates, not with judgment, but with clarity. I don't want an apology from anyone, she said softly. I just want you to remember how it felt to laugh at someone who was only trying to tell the truth. And I want you to think about what kind of person you want to be next time someone tells you theirs. And then she turned and walked back to her seat. Silence held a moment longer, and then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke it. Slowly, one student rose. Then another. And another. Until, row by row, dozens of children stood, some looking uncertain, others proud, but all of them standing. Not clapping. Just standing. A quiet, powerful show of acknowledgement that said, without words, we see you now. The adults followed. Even those who had sat uncomfortably on the sidelines. Even Mrs. Keeley, who had done nothing to stop the laughter that day, stood with eyes wet and lips pressed tightly together. The principal remained frozen for a second longer, then stood as well, unsure of what else to do. But one figure remained seated, Brent Hadley. His jaw was set, but his eyes were unsettled. For the first time, he didn't have a line ready. No quip. No smirk. He stared at the floor like it might offer an escape, but none came. The weight of the moment left him no air. His authority, once unshakable in this building, now sat fractured beneath the gaze of a little girl who had nothing but truth in her corner. Marcus rose once more, not to speak, but to walk to the front. His eyes passed over Hadley only briefly before stopping in front of the principal. He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low but steady enough to be heard by the first few rows. I didn't come here to destroy anyone, he said. I came here to remind people what it costs to ignore the damage done by someone wearing the title of protector. Mrs. Halvorson nodded slowly, her mouth dry, her eyes rimmed with guilt. We didn't know how bad it was, she murmured. Marcus's eyes met hers with no malice, only truth. You didn't want to know. And with that, he walked back to his family. Tamara took his hand, her face etched with pride and restraint. Layla climbed into his lap the moment he sat, and he wrapped his arms around her with quiet strength. The district released a statement the following morning. It included words like deep concern, cultural sensitivity training, and ongoing evaluation of staff conduct. But the headlines told a different story. Father confronts officer in viral school speech, students' truth sparks community reflection, Delta Force dad breaks silence on racism in schools. Marcus ignored the interviews. He turned them all down. He had said what he needed to say. His mission was done. But the real impact wasn't in the coverage or the policy revisions. It was in the way Layla walked into school the next week. Shoulders back. Eyes forward. And in the way kids around her responded, not with fear, but with respect. Not with silence, but with, hey Layla, I saw your speech and, you were really brave. The tides were shifting. And yet, even as peace began to return to their household, one last meeting was scheduled. Requested by Hadley himself. The district called Marcus, saying Brent had asked to speak with him privately. Tamara was skeptical, but Marcus agreed. Not for closure. But because sometimes, letting someone face the truth they helped bury was the final step in real justice. He arrived at the empty school office just before sunset. Hadley was already there, seated, looking smaller than Marcus had ever seen him. No badge. No uniform. Just a man sitting in the remains of a power he once thought was unshakable. When Marcus entered, Hadley stood halfway, then sat back down. I didn't ask you here to argue, Brent said quietly. Marcus nodded but didn't sit. I watched the video of your daughter, Hadley continued. Twice. I guess I thought I understood this job. I thought jokes like that didn't matter. That they were just part of how we connect with kids. You didn't connect, Marcus said simply. You dismissed her. And you let others laugh while she sank into herself. Hadley's hands trembled slightly as he nodded. I know. I didn't see it then. But I do now. I didn't expect it to hit me like this. Marcus didn't soften. It didn't have to take this long. There was a long pause, heavy and loaded. I'm stepping down, Hadley said finally. They gave me the choice. Retire or face the hearing. I don't deserve to wear that badge again. Marcus considered this, then nodded once. Maybe it's not about what you deserve. Maybe it's about what you do next. Hadley looked up, surprised. You're not angry. I'm furious, Marcus replied without hesitation. But anger isn't the legacy I want to leave my daughter. She already showed more strength than you ever did. I just came to make sure you heard it with your own ears. Hadley swallowed hard, his voice cracking. I did. I heard her. Marcus turned to leave, then paused. Don't forget it. And with that, he stepped out into the evening air, where the sky was starting to darken, but Layla's future had never looked more bright. In the days that followed, St. Paul felt like it had exhaled after holding its breath far too long. The video of Marcus and Layla had gone beyond local virality. It had sparked conversations in neighborhoods that normally didn't speak about race, power, or childhood trauma. Social media threads spiraled with debates, essays, outrage, support. But within the Boyd household, the noise of the world outside didn't matter as much as the quiet rebuilding taking place inside. Layla had returned to her routines, school, homework, piano lessons, but something subtle had shifted in her. She still walked with the same small steps, still hugged her books to her chest like they were armor, but her eyes no longer darted with uncertainty. Instead, there was something grounded in her gaze. Something earned. And Marcus could see it every time she looked at him, not with dependence, but with understanding. She had watched him choose words over war, dignity over dominance, and it had changed how she saw not only him, but herself. At school, the environment had changed, though not everyone changed with it. There were students who now whispered less and listened more, and teachers who approached their roles with new caution, more conscious of their presence and their silence. But systems do not transform overnight. Marcus knew this. And so did Layla. They both understood that what had happened was a disruption, a necessary one, but that disruption doesn't mean resolution. It simply cracks the surface. The true test comes in what you do with the exposed truth. The school board, under pressure from media attention and community outrage, launched what they called a Racial Accountability Initiative. They hired diversity consultants, scheduled workshops, and released new language around inclusion. Marcus, however, refused the offer to be part of the advisory committee. He didn't want his voice tokenized, or his family's pain converted into a policy checkbox. Instead, he recommended they speak to Layla's classmates, the teachers, the cafeteria staff, the people who had witnessed the event unfold not on a headline, but on the ground. If you want change, he told them, you start where the harm landed. Meanwhile, Hadley's quiet resignation had become a public curiosity. Rumors swirled about a disciplinary hearing that never happened, about a severance package paid under the table to keep things quiet. Some were furious that he walked away without formal consequences. Others argued he had been punished enough by public humiliation. But the real tension came not from legal outcomes, but from moral questions. Could a man like Hadley truly change? Was he remorseful, or simply embarrassed? Did one moment of reckoning undo years of microaggressions and unchecked power? Tamara, ever direct, was clear on her stance. I don't care what he feels, she said one evening as she and Marcus prepared dinner in near silence, both lost in thought. I care what he does next. If he disappears and reinvents himself somewhere else, then none of this mattered. But if he actually stays in this city, faces people every day who now know who he really is, that's a different kind of consequence. One he can't escape from. Marcus understood her point. But what unsettled him more was the possibility that this whole experience might be reduced to a moment, just another viral story people talked about until the next controversy came along. He didn't want that for Layla. He didn't want her pain to become someone else's teachable anecdote. He wanted her voice to live beyond that gymnasium floor. Then came the invitation from the local university. They were hosting a town hall about trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. The dean personally reached out, asking if Marcus and Layla would attend as guests, not to perform, but to join the conversation. It wasn't a panel. There were no cameras. Just dialogue. Real, raw, and open. Marcus declined at first. He didn't believe in forums that ended in applause. But Layla surprised him. She asked to go. At the event, she sat between her parents, legs swinging nervously under her chair. There were college students in the audience, professors, local leaders. And eventually, as voices shared stories of profiling, alienation, frustration, and reform, Layla stood up, not because she had to, but because her hand moved on its own. She didn't repeat her story. She didn't talk about Hadley. Instead, she asked a question. What do you do when someone hurts you and then says they're sorry, but you still feel the hurt? Her voice was quiet, but everyone leaned in. Are you supposed to forgive them because they said the right thing? Or do you wait until they do something that shows they actually changed? The room didn't have an answer. But in that silence, Layla had introduced something deeper than resolution. She had introduced doubt. And from doubt, empathy often grows. Afterward, a black professor with silver hair approached Marcus and shook his hand. She's braver than most adults I know, he said. Marcus nodded slowly. She taught me everything I know about bravery. The ripple effects of that question extended far beyond the event. Several local schools reached out to Tamara about starting student-led initiatives on racial accountability. Parents began meeting outside PTA channels to discuss how silence enables harm. For once, people were listening to voices they'd previously overlooked. But while the community stirred and changed, Marcus was grappling with something personal. A letter had arrived. Not from a stranger, not from a journalist, but from Hadley. A handwritten note, no return address, just a folded page inside a plain envelope dropped off at the school office and passed to Marcus through the principal. He almost threw it away. But something made him open it. The letter wasn't long. Hadley didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for sympathy. He simply recounted the moment in the gymnasium from his point of view, the silence after Marcus's words, the way Layla's voice echoed louder than he thought possible, the way his own daughter, now grown and living out of state, called him the day the video aired and said, "You're the reason I stayed quiet about so many things." The line hit Marcus harder than he expected. I thought I was being strong, Hadley had written. But now I see I was only afraid. Afraid of being small, of being questioned, of being wrong. And I used humor as a shield because I thought truth was something only I was allowed to own. Your daughter showed me otherwise. Marcus folded the letter once, slid it into a drawer, and didn't speak of it to anyone for days. Not even Tamara. Because he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't trust it. But he didn't disregard it either. That was the dilemma, what to do with a person who might be changing, not for show, but in slow, uncomfortable silence. Who might never be a hero, but who might also no longer be the villain. That internal struggle followed Marcus into every quiet moment after. On jogs through the neighborhood, during long drives with the radio off, in the way he looked at Layla and wondered what scars she carried beneath her calm. He had delivered justice, yes, but justice is never a clean cut. There's always residue. Always the question of what now. Then, one morning, as he packed Layla's lunch and she rattled off facts about ocean currents from a book she was reading, she stopped suddenly and looked at him. Do you think people like Officer Hadley really learn? She asked. Marcus put the apple slices into her lunchbox, then looked up. Sometimes. Not all at once. But sometimes. She nodded thoughtfully, then smiled a little. I hope he does. And just like that, the weight in Marcus's chest loosened, not because the story was over, but because his daughter had already begun to write the next chapter. It was no longer about what had been done to her. It was about what she would do with the voice she had fought to reclaim. And that voice was just beginning to echo. Late one evening, well after dinner and after the dishes had been rinsed and stacked neatly in the dishwasher, Marcus sat alone on the back porch. The sky over St. Paul had turned the color of iron, deep and clouded, pressing a quiet stillness over the neighborhood. The soft hum of crickets mixed with the distant whisper of passing cars created a kind of steady background rhythm, but Marcus wasn't hearing any of it. His focus was on the folded letter that now lay on the wooden table in front of him. He had read it twice already, and yet it still pulled at something inside him that he couldn't quite name. The words weren't poetic, weren't even particularly well written, but they were raw, stripped of the smug confidence that had once followed every one of Brent Hadley's actions. Marcus had seen all kinds of confessions in his life, from prisoners of war, from cornered enemies, from young soldiers broken under pressure, but this one unsettled him in a different way. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so, still. It felt less like a man seeking redemption and more like one confronting the edge of himself for the first time. Tamara stepped outside, pulling her cardigan tighter as the breeze swept through. She spotted the letter and raised an eyebrow, already guessing. She sat beside him, quiet for a moment, before she spoke. "You're not going to write him back, are you?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't think there's anything left to say." "But you read it more than once." "Yeah," he said, running his hand over his jaw. "I did." Tamara leaned forward, staring at him intently, her voice softer now. "What do you want to happen, Marcus? Honestly." He let the question settle between them. Then, finally, he replied. "I want to know it wasn't just a moment. That everything Layla went through, meant something more than a headline. I want to believe people like him don't just go quiet until it's safe to be loud again. I want him to be different. Not for me. For the next black girl who stands in a room full of people and dares to speak her truth." Tamara nodded, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she looked toward the kitchen window where Layla, still in her pajamas, sat drawing quietly at the table with her headphones on. "She's changed too, you know." "I know," Marcus said, watching her silhouette through the glass. "She doesn't ask for your approval the way she used to. She asks because she respects you. That's not the same thing." He nodded, then turned his gaze back to the letter. "I wonder if he sees that too." In the following weeks, the city's attention began to shift again. A local election. A public transit strike. The world moved on, as it always does. But within Northview Elementary, the air hadn't completely settled. Staff meetings felt more weighted. Some teachers walked on eggshells. Others leaned into the change, stepping into their discomfort with humility. The school implemented a new protocol, monthly student-led dialogue circles where kids could voice their experiences and ask questions, moderated by trained counselors. Layla, to her own surprise, was invited to co-lead the very first one. She was nervous, of course. The idea of speaking again in front of classmates, especially now that so many saw her as a symbol, felt heavier than before. But Marcus walked her to school that morning, holding her hand a little longer at the gate. Before she walked in, she looked up at him and whispered, "What if I say the wrong thing?" He knelt beside her, adjusting the collar of her coat. "Then you say it again. Better. Louder. Braver. That's how we learn." She smiled, a little more sure of herself, and stepped inside. The dialogue circle was held in the library, where a circle of colorful rugs and low chairs replaced the usual neat rows of bookshelves and reading mats. About 20 students from different grades sat cross-legged or perched on bean bags, some holding notebooks, some just staring wide-eyed at the scene. Layla sat with a co-leader from the 5th grade, a tall girl named Priya who had been one of the first to stand during the assembly weeks ago. The first topic was simple: what does fairness mean to you? But as each student spoke, the answers grew more complex. Some talked about fairness in grades, in games, in rules on the playground. Then, slowly, the conversation began to shift. A boy in Layla's class raised his hand and said, "I used to think it was fair if everyone got treated the same. But now I think it's only fair if people are treated how they need to be treated to feel safe." Layla looked at him, surprised. It was Noah, one of the boys who had laughed that day in the auditorium. He glanced at her after he spoke, then looked away quickly. But she understood. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about naming it, and doing something with it. Later, in the car ride home, Layla leaned against the window, watching the trees blur by, her voice soft. "Do you think people really change when they feel bad about something?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he said, "People change when the guilt turns into responsibility. Feeling bad is easy. Doing something about it, that's where the work is." She nodded slowly. "I think Noah's trying. I think so too." That night, a delivery arrived at the house, an envelope addressed to Layla. Inside was a drawing. It was a sketch of her standing on a stage, surrounded by kids who were listening instead of laughing. In the corner, written in uneven but careful handwriting, were the words, "You helped me see people better." There was no name. Just the picture. Layla stared at it for a long time, holding it as if it were made of glass. Tamara came over, saw the drawing, and smiled gently. "Looks like someone found their voice because you used yours." Layla didn't speak. She just tucked the picture into the back of her journal. Meanwhile, across the city, Brent Hadley was learning what silence truly felt like. The badge was gone. The routines were gone. His name, once enough to fill a room, now barely held weight in conversation. He had taken a job in private security, low profile, no public appearances. But every so often, someone would recognize him. At the grocery store. At the bank. At the park. Sometimes they looked away. Sometimes they stared. One older man simply walked up, shook his head, and muttered, "You should have known better." And walked off. Brent didn't defend himself anymore. Not because he didn't have words, but because the weight of them had changed. He started attending sessions at a local racial justice center, not as a speaker, not as a guest, but as a participant. He sat in the back. Listened. Took notes. Spoke only when invited. When asked why he was there, he didn't say, "I'm trying to fix my reputation." He said, "Because I helped break something, and I need to understand how." He still carried shame, but it had begun to shift into something else, accountability. Quiet, unseen accountability. The kind that doesn't demand praise, but still chooses to stay in the room. And even though Marcus never responded to his letter, Brent kept it close. Not as proof that he was forgiven. But as a reminder of the man he had once been, and the child whose courage revealed it. Back at home, Layla sat on her bedroom floor, her journal open in her lap. She flipped through pages filled with doodles, quotes, dreams, and now, truths. At the top of one page, she wrote, "What would the world look like if people listened the first time someone spoke?" Then she closed the book, placed it on her nightstand, and turned off the light. Because even in the dark, she knew the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. The final stretch of fall began to settle over St. Paul like a heavy blanket, the kind that draped the city in silence and breathless transition. Leaves turned darker shades of orange and rust before falling to earth without fanfare, and daylight disappeared a little earlier with each passing day. Inside the Boyd house, the rhythm of life continued, but it was different now, slightly slower, more thoughtful. Conversations around the dinner table were no longer just about school assignments or what to watch on TV. They carried more weight, more nuance. Layla had developed a habit of asking questions that lingered in the air long after she spoke them. Questions like, why do people wait until they're caught to care, or how do you know if someone really means what they say? Questions no adult could answer simply. Not even Marcus, who had faced life-and-death decisions in distant war zones, could approach those questions without taking a breath first. The complexity of them wasn't in the language, it was in the honesty. And that honesty demanded silence before response. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Layla sat in the living room with her notebook balanced on her knees, her eyes scanning over her own handwriting as Marcus entered with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed her one, then sat across from her, his shoulders easing into the worn couch like he hadn't truly rested all week. The light from the window stretched softly across the floor, coloring everything in a warm gray. Without looking up, Layla asked, "Have you ever forgiven someone you didn't think deserved it?" The question wasn't sudden. It had been building for days. Since the letter. Since the drawing. Since Noah, and the assembly, and the silence that still followed her sometimes like a shadow. Marcus stirred his drink slowly, letting the steam fog his glasses slightly before he removed them. "Yeah," he said eventually. "I have." She looked up at him now, waiting. "Why?" "Because holding on to that anger was costing me more than letting it go," he replied, his voice quiet. "Not because the other person earned my forgiveness. But because I didn't want to carry them with me anymore." Layla blinked, absorbing his words. "But what if you forgive them, and they don't change? Then you didn't forgive them for their sake. You did it for yours." She didn't say anything after that. Just nodded and returned to her notebook, but her pen didn't move. She sat with his words like she was trying them on, feeling where they were still too big or too small. At school, the changes that had begun were continuing to evolve, though slowly. The dialogue circles became more regular, now held bi-weekly, and more students began attending voluntarily. Some teachers even started sitting in, not to supervise, but to listen. Layla remained one of the youngest facilitators, but her voice was no longer the softest. She had learned how to guide discussions, how to ask the right questions, how to pause in silence and let it stretch long enough to invite truth into the room. She was becoming a leader, though she never called herself one. She didn't seek titles. She sought clarity. In one of the sessions, a boy from another class, Malik, shared a story about being followed by a staff member in the hallway because he didn't have a hall pass. He said he wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being seen as a problem before being seen as a person. After he spoke, Layla didn't respond with advice. She simply said, "That sounds heavy." Malik nodded. "It is." And in that exchange, there was healing. Not because a solution had been offered, but because the weight had been named. Meanwhile, Brent Hadley continued his quiet reconstruction. He didn't return to law enforcement. Instead, he took a job as a night security supervisor at a local hospital. The role paid less, offered little authority, and came with none of the recognition he used to thrive on. But it gave him something he hadn't had before: time. Time to think, to reflect, to sit in spaces where he was no longer the loudest voice. He started attending community forums, not as a speaker, not even to ask questions, but just to listen. He didn't correct people when they spoke of injustice. He didn't flinch when his name was mentioned in criticism. He took it. Sat with it. And when someone approached him at a forum and said, "You're the reason my daughter doesn't trust police," he simply said, "I believe you." But for all the quiet growth, the city still carried tensions. Not everyone supported the changes. Some parents complained about politics being brought into schools. Others defended Hadley even now, suggesting he had been made a scapegoat for a bigger issue. There were board meetings filled with tension, social media threads filled with vitriol, and teachers caught in the middle. Marcus and Tamara never attended those meetings. They had seen enough. What mattered to them wasn't the debate. It was Layla's clarity, her strength, her emotional fluency. They were raising a child who had faced humiliation and transformed it into purpose. No meeting minutes could match that. One evening, after a particularly difficult dialogue session where a student broke down in tears while sharing her experience of being overlooked in class, Layla came home more quiet than usual. She didn't eat much at dinner, didn't say much during her bath, and when Marcus came to check on her, he found her sitting on the floor of her room, knees pulled to her chest. He sat beside her without speaking. After a few minutes, she whispered, "It's too much sometimes. Listening to all of it. Holding it. I feel like I don't know what to say anymore." He nodded, understanding. You don't always have to say something. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is just be there. But what if being there isn't enough? He took a deep breath, then said, "Then you rest. You breathe. You remember that you're not alone. That it's not all on your shoulders." She looked up at him, her eyes tired. "Do you ever feel like you're still in a fight even when everything looks calm?" "All the time," he said. She leaned into him then, resting her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that until her breathing evened out. Days later, the principal called Marcus. She had a proposal. Northview was planning an event, something different. Not another assembly. Not another forum. This time, it would be a storytelling night. A stage open for students, staff, and even parents to share a 5-minute story about a moment that changed them. No themes. No pressure. Just truth. She asked if Layla would be interested. Marcus asked Layla that night. She hesitated. "I don't know if I want to tell the same story again," she said. "Everyone already knows it." "Then tell the part they don't know," Marcus said. "What part is that?" "The part about what came after." The night of the event, the gym was filled again. Not with tension this time, but with anticipation. The lights were softer, the chairs arranged in a semicircle around a small, lit platform. One by one, people stepped up. A janitor shared a story about his first day on the job and the fear he felt being judged by teachers. A teacher told a story about being the only white person in her college dorm and realizing how much she had to unlearn. A student told a story about being adopted and not knowing where she fit in. Then Layla walked up. She stood still for a second, letting the silence find its shape. Then she began. "I used to think stories were about heroes and villains. That you had to be one or the other. But I learned that most of us are something in between. I thought I'd always be the girl who was laughed at. Who had to prove that what she said was true. But then I learned that proving it wasn't the point. Believing it was. And I did. And I do." She paused, scanning the room. "Sometimes I still feel small. Like I'm not ready for the way people look at me now. But I'm learning that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about showing up anyway. And I'm showing up." When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It exhaled. It softened. And in that moment, the story wasn't about Hadley anymore. It wasn't even about what happened. It was about what she became. And no one could take that from her. After the event, Marcus held her hand as they walked to the car under the soft glow of streetlights. "You showed up," he said. She smiled. "So did you." They didn't say much else. They didn't need to. Because some stories don't need an ending to mean something. They just need a beginning that never forgets where it started. Winter arrived in St. Paul quietly, coating the sidewalks and rooftops in a soft white hush that seemed to calm even the most restless corners of the city. The transformation wasn't just in the streets or the air, it was in the people. In the way they paused longer before speaking, listened with more care, and carried themselves as if aware of the invisible weight others might be holding. At Northview Elementary, the cold season didn't freeze progress, it crystallized it. What had once been an eruption of conflict had become a turning point, a recalibration of values that no one could ignore. Dialogue circles were now a permanent part of the curriculum, woven into the rhythm of the school year like math or science. Teachers volunteered to be trained not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand how to do better. The leadership team shifted priorities, no longer obsessed with appearance, but focused instead on presence, being there, showing up, learning from discomfort instead of hiding behind bureaucracy. Layla, now 10, was no longer just the girl from the video. She had become something much rarer, an example. But not the performative kind. She didn't seek applause or validation. What defined her now was her consistency. She continued to speak when it mattered, to step up without waiting for permission. Her classmates didn't see her as a victim, or even just brave, they saw her as a peer who had gone through fire and returned clearer, stronger, and still kind. That kindness is what set her apart. She never sought to humiliate or punish anyone, even those who once laughed the loudest. She carried herself with a maturity that seemed impossible for her age, but perfectly natural to who she had become. Marcus, too, had grown, not in public visibility, but in internal clarity. He had always known how to protect, how to confront, how to remain composed under pressure. But what he learned through Layla was something entirely different: how to let someone else lead, how to step back without disappearing, how to teach without controlling. His mission had shifted from defense to legacy. One day, while reading in the living room, he received a message from the Department of Education. They had heard of his speech, had seen the way his daughter's story had sparked change, and they wanted to invite him to participate in a national panel on fathers and education. Not as a soldier. As a dad. The invitation didn't flatter him, it humbled him. And when he discussed it with Tamara, she smiled and said, "Looks like you've got a new battlefield." Brent Hadley's story didn't end in disgrace, but it didn't end in redemption either. It continued, quietly, honestly, far from spotlights. He remained in his hospital job, still attending sessions at the community center, still doing the kind of work that doesn't come with applause. One morning, he received a handwritten letter, slid into his locker without a return name. It was from a parent of a student at Northview. The letter didn't excuse his past. It didn't thank him. It simply said, "We're watching. Keep going." It was the kind of accountability that doesn't shame, but doesn't forget. That letter stayed in his wallet from that day on. Tamara, who had once clenched her jaw during every quiet injustice, now found herself speaking more. Not louder, but more. She began attending city forums, advising school boards, and mentoring young mothers on how to advocate for their children without burning themselves out. Her fire hadn't dimmed, it had focused. And in Layla, she saw her own younger self, but more prepared, more protected, more heard. One night, while folding laundry with Marcus, she said, "Maybe we did something right." He looked at her and replied, "No maybe about it." But perhaps the most unexpected shift came in the form of a single, ordinary school day. Nothing remarkable. No assembly. No news cameras. Just a regular Friday. During recess, a new student had been accused of lying about her mom being a firefighter. A group of kids surrounded her, teasing, poking, laughing. Layla saw it happen from across the yard. She walked straight over, stepped between them, and asked the girl, "Is your mom a firefighter?" The girl, holding back tears, nodded. Without hesitation, Layla turned to the others and said, "Then believe her. That's what we do now." The others looked at each other, unsure, but slowly backed off. The girl sniffled, surprised, then smiled. Layla didn't need to be congratulated. She just went back to her swing. That small moment, invisible to most, was the true ending. Not because it closed a chapter, but because it proved the story had echoed. That it had passed from one person to another, like a spark in dry grass, igniting a chain reaction of awareness and choice. The kind of fire that warms without burning, that lights without destroying. The kind that changes culture, not through punishment, but through presence, through clarity, through courage passed down like a family heirloom. So if you've been with us from the beginning of this story, ask yourself this: what would you have done in that auditorium? Would you have laughed? Stayed silent? Looked away? Or would you have stood up? And more importantly, what do you do now, when no one's watching? This story wasn't just about injustice. It was about choice. Every character had one. Some chose silence. Some chose courage. Some chose to leave. Some chose to stay and change. But in the end, the most powerful transformation wasn't the punishment or the praise, it was the ripple. The quiet impact of one child choosing truth over fear. So now it's your turn. What kind of ripple are you creating? If this story moved you, challenged you, made you think, or made you feel, share it. Let it live beyond this moment. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And of course, subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, emotional stories that reveal what hides beneath the surface, because sometimes, the biggest twist, is the truth we choose to tell.